The low hum of the quantum resonance chamber filled the lab, vibrating through the reinforced flooring like the pulse of a living heart. Dr. Ilara Voss stood rigid at the observation console, her fingers hovering over the touch interface as the multiverse stabilizer thrummed to life. Outside the lab's thick, radiation-proof windows, the city skyline of New Vienna shimmered under the muted light of twin moons. Oblivious to the experiment that might fracture the foundations of reality itself, she felt a twinge in her chest, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and the nagging suspicion that they were playing with forces humanity barely understood. Across the chamber, Captain Ryland Cale paced, the folds of his uniform shifting with each measured step, his expression a mask of strategic focus. He had been drafted into this research project not for his understanding of theoretical physics, but for his ability to manage operations under extreme, often lethal pressure. And this operation promised extremes beyond anything he had faced. The initial tests had been innocuous, localized, shifting subatomic particles in isolation, observing faint echoes of parallel quantum states. But now they were attempting a coordinated lattice-scale entanglement, synchronizing the stabilizer across multiple sites simultaneously. The risk was no longer academic. Ryland glanced at his field captain, Lieutenant Mara Thorne, whose dark eyes betrayed her tension even as she calibrated the tactical comms. Her role was simple, yet perilous. Ensure the perimeter remained secure against opportunistic intrusions, while monitoring the energy flux for patterns that could indicate instability. In other words, she was the human firewall between a controlled experiment and catastrophic collapse. Mara's hand twitched over the drone control console, her mind racing through contingencies. Even with layered shielding and automated countermeasures, there was no precedent for the forces they were about to awaken. No simulations could fully predict what might emerge from the interstitial folds of parallel realities. The first anomaly appeared almost innocuously, a ripple across the temporal spectral scanner, a brief distortion in the electromagnetic baseline that lasted microseconds. Voss, we've got a fluctuation at node 7, Mara called out, her voice tight. It's outside predicted parameters. Ilara leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Is it a calibration error? She asked, though her tone betrayed doubt. She knew it wasn't. These systems had been triple-checked, the code audited down to every possible exception. The anomaly pulsed again, stronger, like a heartbeat vibrating against the glass, and then the lab lights flickered as if responding to some external heartbeat of the cosmos itself. Ryland stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the console. Hold all expansions, he ordered. No escalation until we understand what we're dealing with. The words carried authority, but beneath them lay the tension of a man who knew the calculus of risk intimately. One misstep, one misjudgment, and the ripple could cascade beyond containment. Minutes passed as the team ran diagnostics, each second stretching with the tension of inevitability. The scanners, normally precise to fractions of a nanosecond, began to jitter, producing data streams that defied conventional analysis. Dr. Voss's face was pale, jaw tight. It's not just interference, she muttered. It's information. Something is trying to communicate through the lattice. Ryland's brow furrowed. Communicate? Or manipulate? The question hung heavy. In military operations, there was a difference between signals intelligence and hostile intervention. In this domain, that distinction might not exist in any familiar sense. Mara's fingers flew over the drone interface, activating pattern recognition subroutines and environmental scans. No localized source, no physical intrusion. But the waveform, it's coherent, intentional. The room went silent. The only sound, the low mechanical resonance of the stabilizer, now trembling under the strain of forces they could neither see nor fully understand. The first real warning came in the form of displacement events, small objects in the lab jittering, phasing in and out of visibility for split seconds, as if caught between parallel realities. A chair wavered like a mirage, then snapped back into its original position. Instruments oscillated violently, some reading impossibly high energies before collapsing to zero. Ryland's pulse quickened, but he remained outwardly composed. Just contain the area. Lock all personnel to anchor points. Nobody leaves the chamber until we have a stable read. Mara's nod was barely perceptible, but her mind raced through tactical improvisations. The lab's automated damping fields could slow the destabilization, but they were not designed for sustained interference at this magnitude. She needed a way to stabilize the nodes manually, something that no one had yet attempted. The ethical and operational calculus twisted around her thoughts. Every additional human intervention increased risk, but doing nothing meant potentially uncontrolled multiversal exposure. Then came the signal itself. It was subtle at first, a modulation in the quantum flux, but undeniably patterned, a deliberate rhythm. Ilara's eyes widened. This isn't random, she said, voice barely above a whisper. It's intelligence. It's aware of us. The room's atmosphere thickened with a sudden shared understanding of vulnerability. Here, in a sterile, highly controlled environment, they were encountering something that had no known precedent, no manual, no historical archive to consult. Ryland's mind snapped into tactical assessment mode, listing constraints, power reserves, field stability, comm latency, structural integrity of the lab, human endurance under psychological strain. All of it suggested a single truth. The human team was at a disadvantage. Their adversary, if it could be called that, operated outside conventional spacetime. Every strategy rooted in linear causality could be rendered irrelevant in an instant. He clenched his jaw. We adapt. We find the pattern. We take control, or we shut it down permanently. The first engagement, if it could be described that way, happened when a local energy spike emanated from the multiverse stabilizer, creating a temporary portal, barely half a meter across, but enough to project a fragment of an alternate reality into their lab. A duplicate version of Mara flickered into existence, mirrored down to the smallest detail. The apparition mimicked her movements, but in reverse, a subtle but deeply disorienting inversion. Mara's training kicked in instantly. She raised her arm reflexively, activating the drone swarm to deploy a non-lethal suppression field. The mirrored Mara reacted faster, phasing out just before impact. Alara screamed, instinctively shielding the instruments. The incident revealed the first exploitable insight. These intrusions obeyed identifiable, if non-intuitive, rules. Mirroring, phase-shifting, temporal inversion. They were not omnipotent. They were patterns waiting to be decoded. Ryland's mind raced. And we document every interaction, every displacement, every echo. That's our leverage. By mid-cycle, the team had already lost control of several auxiliary instruments, and small fires had ignited in overloaded conduits. Mara coordinated a tactical perimeter, her voice calm but urgent over the comms. Ryland, if we can isolate the core lattice nodes, we might create a directional feedback loop, force the projection to stabilize, or collapse it entirely. Ryland nodded. Do it, but leave an escape vector. No heroics. Each movement was choreographed under life-threatening uncertainty. They deployed stabilizing drones, manually modulated the lattice energy, and monitored the flux patterns with Alara providing real-time theoretical calculations. Sweat slicked her forehead, eyes flickering between monitors, fingers moving with robotic precision. The room was a dance of physics and tactical improvisation, humanity straining against an incomprehensible adversary. By the fourth oscillation, the mirrored apparitions began coordinating, demonstrating intelligence and adaptability. The mirrored Mara reached toward a console, only for Mara herself to intercept, shoving her against the wall with a strength born of adrenaline and terror. Sparks rained from the console, shrapnel nicking Ryland's arm, tearing a shallow cut that bled onto the floor. It was a visceral reminder. This was no longer theoretical. They were fighting for containment, for survival, and the enemy was learning. Alara shouted calculations that Ryland barely had time to interpret, launching drones in improvised patterns that forced the mirrors to oscillate erratically, destabilizing their coherence. For a moment, victory seemed possible. The mirrored projections wavered, faltered, then dissipated, leaving the lab in tenuous calm. But Ryland knew it was temporary. Each interaction refined the adversary's understanding. They were learning faster than he could anticipate. The problem had escalated from containment to adaptation. The human element, always the weak link, was being tested to its extreme limit. At the end of the cycle, the team stood bloodied, exhausted, but defiant. Mara scanned the lattice outputs. They mirror us, but they overcompensate under stress. That's our opening. Alara's fingers hovered above the console, eyes wide with both fear and awe. If we can synchronize the stabilizer across a wider spatial vector, she said, voice shaking, we might force them into a closed loop. Trap the projections long enough to analyze or neutralize. Ryland took a slow breath, hands trembling as adrenaline surged. He knew the cost. This would strain every system, risk permanent structural damage, and might kill them all if miscalculated. And yet, for the first time, he felt a tactical advantage. The enemy had a pattern. They had a weakness. The game had shifted. Then we take it, he said quietly, his words carrying both command and promise. We fight by the rules they can't fully anticipate. Outside the lab, New Vienna's skyline remained oblivious, bathed in the pale glow of twin moons, as forces beyond comprehension lurked at the threshold of reality itself. The first skirmish had ended, but the war and the lessons it would demand had only just begun. The dawn cycle in New Vienna brought no comfort. The lab's emergency lighting cast long, jittering shadows across the reinforced floors, flickering in irregular bursts as the multiverse stabilizer hummed at near maximum load. Outside, the city's streets were empty. The twin moons low on the horizon, pale witnesses to the invisible war unfolding across overlapping realities. Dr. Alara Voss hunched over the console, fingers trembling as she traced the waveforms from the previous night's skirmish. The mirrored apparitions had retreated, but the data they left behind was both tantalizing and terrifying. They had patterns, behavioral signatures that could be anticipated, but the instability in the lattice was growing. Every cycle of testing pushed the threshold of system endurance and human tolerance alike. She felt the weight of every life tethered to her calculations. Mara's sharp instincts, Ryland's precise command, the junior tech's tentative hands. Each misstep now could trigger a cascade with consequences beyond imagination. Rylan Kale moved through the lab like a storm contained. His left arm was bandaged from the minor injury during the last encounter, the crimson seeping slowly into the sterile white dressing. He ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on logistics, energy reserves, lattice node integrity, drone availability, and personnel fatigue. "We've got 20 operational drones left after last night," he muttered, voice low but commanding. "Now reboot the auxiliary arrays and patch the destabilized nodes. Mara, I want continuous observation on the periphery. If they try another incursion, we need every second of advance notice." Mara nodded, jaw tight, already navigating the interface with precise, fluid motions. Her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she tried to mask. The mirrored entities had tested her limits in unpredictable ways. Force, reflex, and tactical decision-making had been inverted against her. She had emerged physically unharmed but mentally frayed, the edges of her confidence blurred by an adversary that learned as quickly as she acted. Each decision now required split-second calculations, balancing speed against precision, and the margin for error was microscopic. Alara turned toward the projection matrix, where streams of quantum data converged in a shimmering lattice of energy, complex and fragile. "We've identified subtle phase lags in the mirrored projections," she said, voice quivering with a mix of awe and apprehension. "They're predictable only if we force their interactions within controlled parameters. If we can manipulate the phase inversion at the right temporal intervals, we can trap them long enough to study their structure, or collapse them entirely." Ryland's eyes narrowed. "Study or destroy? We can't risk uncontrolled feedback." Ilara exhaled sharply, tracing the energy arcs with a stylus. "We may not have a choice. If they adapt faster than we can contain, containment fails, and then the stabilizer itself becomes a vector for uncontrolled reality breaches." She paused. "We're talking potential casualties across overlapping spaces. Entire zones could be compromised." The weight of her words sank into the room like a physical presence, a reminder that their mission was no longer theoretical. The stakes were raw, immediate, and morally daunting. Mara adjusted the periphery feed, noticing subtle distortions in the air currents near the outer containment shields. "Rylan," she said, tension threading her words, "there's something moving out there. Not a projection, but a field anomaly. Energy readings spike every few seconds, almost like it's anticipating our response." Rylan strode to her station, scanning the metrics. "It's coherent," he muttered. "Intelligent. And it's probing our defenses." The realization hit him in that quiet, clinical way commanders sometimes experience before the battlefield erupts. Their enemy had agency, and the battlefield was no longer just a physical space. It was overlapping realities, each with its own variables, each capable of influencing the other. "Prepare contingency protocols," he ordered. "We'll need emergency extraction vectors, automated lattice recalibration, and full-spectrum drone coverage. Mara, prioritize mobility. If the anomalies breach the chamber, evacuate personnel to secure nodes immediately." Her fingers danced over the interface, eyes flicking between fluctuating data and the stabilizer's energy matrix. Every system was at its operational limit, yet the patterns suggested a calculable vulnerability. They had to exploit it, and fast. The team spent hours recalibrating, running simulations on analog hardware while the main lattice continued its hum, straining against the unseen forces pressing at the edges of reality. Dr. Voss worked in tandem with Rylan, translating theoretical models into actionable parameters. "We can't overload the main stabilizer," she said, her voice hoarse from the constant mental effort. "The reactors can handle only one phase inversion loop at a time. Any additional strain risks total lattice collapse." Rylan nodded, absorbing the implications. "Then we build the loop externally. Drone-delivered nodes, phased to the stabilizer's core frequency. Force the projections into a controlled feedback trap without stressing the main system." The logic was sound, but the execution would demand precision, coordination, and a willingness to accept collateral risk. Mara's gaze flicked to him, silently questioning if the calculus included the human cost. Ryland's expression softened, if only for a moment. "We win, or we fail with honor. There's no other option." The offensive began at twilight. Automated drones, carrying auxiliary lattice nodes, deployed in precise formation across the lab's outer perimeter. Each node was a fragile beacon of stability, designed to interact with the stabilizer's frequency and create a controlled entrapment zone. Mara piloted the lead drone herself, navigating turbulent quantum distortions that caused instruments to flicker and data streams to warp. The mirrored projections appeared almost immediately, phasing into the drone corridors, flickering and inverting in predictable patterns. Mara reacted instinctively, rerouting nodes, adjusting frequencies, and using the projections' mirroring behavior against them. Each projection that attempted to intercept a drone was forced into a feedback oscillation, temporarily destabilizing its coherence. It was a small victory, but it came at a high cost. Several drones overloaded, sparks cascading like miniature storms, and Mara's hands ached from the constant corrections. Rylan noted each loss, calculating replacements, all while monitoring human fatigue levels. Every team member teetered at the edge of exhaustion. Inside the lab, Alara implemented real-time adjustments, translating theoretical models into executable sequences with rapid precision. Her face glistened with sweat, eyes fixed on the lattice projections. "Phase inversion aligned," she called, voice taut. "But the energy spikes are rising. Core nodes are at 92% load." Sparks arced across conduits as the stabilizer strained against the feedback loop. Rylan made a calculated decision. Divert auxiliary cooling to core nodes. "Mara, continue the drone sweep. We maintain pressure, or it unravels." The team's cohesion was palpable. Each person was a cog in a machine of unparalleled complexity. Yet tension simmered beneath their coordination. Any error, any hesitation, and the lattice could cascade into multiple spatial disruptions. By the 4th hour, the projections adapted. They no longer mirrored the team in simple inversion. They anticipated, countering adjustments with split-second phase shifts. Mara cursed under her breath, deploying drones in unpredictable arcs, forcing the projections into oscillations they could not stabilize. Alara recalculated constantly, feeding parameters to Rylan, who issued rapid-fire tactical commands. The interplay was dizzying, a mixture of human improvisation and emergent intelligence from forces beyond known reality. And then came the breach. A projection penetrated the outermost containment node, materializing partially in the lab. The anomaly flickered, displaying coherent intelligence, and reached toward the stabilizer. A surge of energy shot through the chamber, knocking Rylan to the floor, slamming him into the console with a force that set off alarms. Mara reacted instantly, activating suppression protocols, while Alara's hands flew over the controls, desperate to stabilize the surge. Sparks and arcs of displaced energy filled the lab, instruments screaming in overload. When the chaos subsided, the team assessed the damage. Several auxiliary nodes were destroyed. The stabilizer core was dangerously close to thermal thresholds, and energy reserves had dropped precipitously. Rylan pushed himself upright, jaw tight. "We survived," he said, voice low but with a grim edge. "Barely." Mara's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. "They're learning faster than we anticipated," she said, voice trembling with fatigue and apprehension. "Every maneuver we make, they adjust." Then came the betrayal. An unexpected signal from one of the auxiliary nodes suggested interference not from projections, but from within human ranks. Junior technician Kel Voss, tasked with peripheral node maintenance, had been compromised, coerced, or perhaps voluntarily acting against the team's interests. The node under his control began transmitting phase feedback that threatened to destabilize the main stabilizer. Mara detected it first, halting drone deployment with a sudden command. "Rylan, Node 14, interference. It's human-sourced. Something's wrong." Rylan's eyes narrowed, the full tactical implication dawning immediately. A breach from inside the operation could undo every advantage, amplify projection adaptability, and risk catastrophic failure. He ordered immediate containment protocols, isolating the node and severing comm links, but the damage had already begun. Minor destabilizations propagated through the lattice, creating temporary rifts that projections exploited, phasing into positions previously secured. The team's tactical situation deteriorated rapidly, forcing split-second improvisation under extreme pressure. Alara's voice rose over the comms, urgent and precise. "We can stabilize the main nodes if we isolate energy conduits 5 and 9, divert power from auxiliary nodes, and initiate rapid phase collapse." Rylan processed the order instantly, directing Mara and other operators in synchronized maneuvers that felt more like a choreographed dance than a battle. Drones were redirected, auxiliary nodes sacrificed to preserve the stabilizer's core integrity. Sparks cascaded from overtaxed circuits, instruments shattered under strain, and the lab's reinforced walls shook under energy feedback. Mara's hands ached, eyes stinging with fatigue, but she maintained precision as drones enacted the collapse sequence. Every second stretched into eternity as projections phased in erratic bursts, sometimes materializing partially in the lab, sometimes in the city's subterranean tunnels. The team fought simultaneously against internal betrayal, environmental hazards, and a hyper-intelligent adversary adapting faster than any human mind could fully anticipate. The decisive moment came when Alara identified a temporal offset, an exploitable delay in projection synchronization across nodes. If exploited, it could force the projections into a closed loop phase collapse, neutralizing their immediate threat. "Rylan," she said, voice tight, "we can force coherence across all trapped projections, but we'll have only one cycle. Miss the window, and everything destabilizes." Rylan's mind ran through contingencies, probabilities, and human limitations. "Do it. Mara, coordinate drone phase alignment. Auxiliary nodes only. No room for error." The operation required simultaneous action across multiple layers, drones adjusting phase fields, nodes collapsing in precise temporal intervals, human operators monitoring lattice integrity, and anticipatory corrections for adaptive projection behavior. Sparks, interference, and momentary instability filled the lab, creating a chaotic ballet of light, sound, and energy. Every second carried potential failure. Every movement demanded perfection. When the cycle completed, a moment of tense silence fell across the team. The projections, once fluid, adaptive, and terrifyingly intelligent, were trapped in a stable feedback loop, temporarily neutralized. Drones hovered like exhausted sentinels, auxiliary nodes pulsed weakly, and the main stabilizer hummed at slightly reduced intensity. Human breaths were ragged, muscles quivering from the relentless strain. Ryland surveyed the room, noting damage to infrastructure, energy reserves depleted beyond optimal levels, and the psychological weight on each team member. They had won a temporary victory, but the Lattice had already recorded their strategy, adapting for the next encounter. The internal breach had been contained, but trust had frayed. And the moral cost of improvisation weighed heavily on the team's cohesion. In the aftermath, the team convened silently, assessing data streams and tallying losses. Mara flexed her stiffened fingers, eyes scanning the Lattice projections with renewed determination. "They're learning," she said softly. "Every maneuver we make, they record. Next time, it won't be temporary. We need a new approach, something completely unpredictable." Alara nodded, face pale but resolute. "We'll need controlled experiments outside the lab, high-risk data gathering. Only by forcing anomalies can we maintain the advantage." Ryland's eyes were sharp, scanning the Lattice readouts, human faces, and city perimeter. "Then we prepare. Offensive, tactical, adaptive. Every cycle, every drone, every auxiliary node, optimized for maximum leverage. Failure isn't an option. Not for the city, not for us." The room held a tense, quiet energy, broken only by the hum of the stabilizer and the low creak of strained infrastructure. They had won battles, but the war, the real escalating war, was only beginning. The projections were intelligent, adaptive, networked across realities. And the human team, despite every sacrifice and every ounce of ingenuity, was still learning to fight on a battlefield that existed beyond comprehension. The city of New Vienna was shrouded in an eerie stillness as night fell, but the lab was anything but calm. The temporary victory over the mirrored projections had yielded invaluable data, yet it had also revealed the terrifying scale of the challenge. Dr. Ilara Voss pored over the oscillation logs, her fingers tracing the Lattice readouts with near-reverent precision. Each feedback loop, each phase alignment, revealed intricate patterns that suggested a collective intelligence coordinating across multiple realities. The projections were no longer just reflexive echoes. They were learning entities, capable of anticipating and countering human improvisation. The stakes had shifted from reactive containment to proactive domination of the battlefield. The team would have to create controlled anomalies, force adaptive responses, and exploit emergent weaknesses, or risk allowing the projections to expand unchecked. Captain Ryland Kale moved like a predator in the control chamber, eyes scanning Lattice readouts, drone telemetry, and auxiliary node statuses simultaneously. His left arm bore the lingering ache of minor injuries, a constant reminder that human limitations imposed constraints even in the face of advanced technology. He reviewed operational parameters, inventorying energy reserves, node deployment capacity, and drone endurance. Each variable was a potential point of failure, each human element a potential vulnerability. "We'll strike multiple vectors simultaneously," he said, voice low, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Drones, auxiliary nodes, and field teams must operate in perfect coordination. Ilara, time the Lattice collapses precisely. Mara, lead the drone sweeps. Every movement must anticipate their adaptation, and every energy allocation must account for failure contingencies." Mara Thorne, seated at the primary drone interface, absorbed the plan with sharp focus. Her eyes darted between feeds as she plotted complex trajectories for the swarm, accounting for quantum latency, environmental interference, and potential countermeasures from the projections. She flexed her hands, grimacing at fatigue that threatened precision. Every sortie would push the limits of both human endurance and mechanical integrity. "We'll need dynamic rerouting," she said, adjusting parameters mid-cycle. "If projections respond as expected, we can force them into predictable loops. But if they anticipate us..." Her words trailed off, leaving the unspoken risk hanging in the room like a storm cloud. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the Lattice, scanning for anomalies. "We'll need external triggers," she said, voice tight. "Localized energy surges, small but intense, across multiple nodes. They'll force the projections to redistribute, reveal patterns, and create exploitable offsets. If we time it correctly, we can collapse them into controlled feedback loops." She hesitated, then added almost under her breath, "But one misstep, and the destabilization could cascade through the city." The first phase of the multi-vector operation began at dusk. Drones, equipped with microlattice nodes and temporary phase anchors, swarmed across predetermined vectors. Each node emitted subtle, pulsed distortions designed to force the projections to move predictably. Mara guided the drones with unerring precision, recalculating paths in real time as energy fluctuations from the projections warped the environment. Sparks leapt from overloaded conduits as minor nodes collapsed, forcing immediate improvisation. Ryland's voice remained steady over comms, issuing corrections, reallocating auxiliary power, and anticipating potential breaches. The choreography was tense and intricate. Every move a combination of tactical discipline and split-second creativity, every miscalculation a potential disaster. In the field, junior operators deployed experimental anomalies, localized high-intensity pulses designed to force projection relocation. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Mirrored entities phased erratically, some materializing partially in physical space, others flickering in transient loops, displacing debris and creating temporary microcollapses in the lattice. Mara adjusted drone paths to anticipate displacement vectors, while Alara recalibrated node phases to maintain lattice coherence. Sparks of displaced energy and distorted gravity rippled across the lab floor, creating a tangible sense of danger. The human team pressed on, coordinating their actions with precision born of desperation, forcing the projections to reveal both structure and weakness. Then came the first casualty. One of the auxiliary nodes, overloaded by a miscalculated phase collapse, erupted violently, sending shards of conductive material across the lab. A secondary micro-drone deployed nearby was destroyed, and the resulting surge momentarily destabilized a portion of the main lattice. Ryland's pulse quickened, and he barked orders, rerouting energy and stabilizing the core manually. The team moved with mechanical precision, patching failures, isolating surges, and compensating for human limitations. Every action demanded courage and discipline, yet the cost was immediately tangible. Personnel fatigue, mechanical loss, and the haunting realization that one error could spiral into catastrophe. The projections, now fully aware of the multi-vector assault, adapted rapidly. They began forming coordinated patterns, effectively using spatial and temporal distortions to counter human intervention. Some phased into areas previously cleared, while others oscillated in unanticipated inversions, testing both human reflexes and drone precision. Mara's hands flew over the interface, diverting drones, recalibrating nodes, and predicting projection behavior. Sparks of displaced energy licked the air, making it difficult to distinguish between real threats and phase-induced illusions. The lab became a nexus of high-stakes improvisation, each team member's skill tested to the absolute limit. Amid the chaos, Ryland observed a critical pattern. The projection's adaptation was remarkably fast, but not instantaneous. There was a brief latency between environmental stimuli and their coordinated response. He ordered the team to exploit this delay, synchronizing drone trajectories with microlattice collapses to force projections into temporary loops. The effect was almost instantaneous. Several entities became trapped, oscillating in controlled cycles, revealing internal structures and behavioral algorithms previously inaccessible. Alara's face lit with grim satisfaction as she recorded the data. "We can map their intelligence," she said. "We can predict adaptation, if we maintain control. But victory carried immediate cost. One projection, larger and more coherent than previous instances, phased unpredictably into the lab, knocking over instrumentation and creating a cascade of energy feedback. Sparks arced violently, temporarily blinding Mara, while Ryland was thrown against the wall. The human team reacted instinctively, deploying suppression nodes and rerouting energy to stabilize the lattice. Minor injuries were sustained, burns, contusions, and temporary disorientation. Yet, through discipline, coordination, and improvisation, they contained the anomaly. Every human limitation was pushed to its extreme, yet they survived, a testament to tactical ingenuity and relentless resolve. As the operation progressed, a pivotal event occurred. One of the previously compromised nodes, thought neutralized after the internal betrayal, began transmitting anomalous energy patterns that suggested not malevolence, but potential communication from the projections themselves. Ilara observed the signal with fascination and fear. "They're adapting socially," she said. "There's a networked consciousness coordinating responses, possibly even negotiating behavior. If we can interpret this, we might influence them rather than destroy them." Ryland absorbed the data, weighing risk against tactical opportunity. "Then we test it," he said, carefully. "Any misstep and containment fails, but this may be our edge." The human team enacted controlled interaction. Microlattice nodes emitted modulated pulses designed to elicit predictable reactions from the projections without destabilizing the main lattice. Mara piloted drones and arcs that allowed the projections to respond, effectively negotiating behavioral patterns through forced feedback. The effect was astonishing. The projections began reorganizing in predictable, analyzable structures, revealing vulnerabilities and response algorithms that had been invisible during raw combat. The human team had shifted from purely defensive to nuanced manipulation, using intelligence, discipline, and improvisation as weapons. However, the operation demanded sacrifice. One auxiliary node, critical to maintaining phase integrity across multiple vectors, overloaded irreversibly during the interaction, releasing an uncontrolled surge that partially phased the lab itself. Minor structural damage occurred, equipment was destroyed, and 2 team members suffered temporary incapacitation from energy feedback. Ryland moved immediately to stabilize human personnel and lattice coherence, while Mara recalibrated drones mid-flight to compensate. The team pressed on despite the cost. Every second of hesitation risked collapse. Their resolve was tested in real time, their grit the only thing keeping the multi-vector operation viable. By the conclusion of the cycle, the projections had been partially stabilized, with intelligence patterns revealed and previously invisible weaknesses exposed. The human team, battered, exhausted, and tested beyond prior limits, had achieved a precarious advantage. They had learned to exploit delay, coordination, and emergent intelligence to manipulate the adversary rather than merely react to it. Alara recorded the final phase outputs, noting that these patterns could form the basis of predictive modeling capable of guiding future operations. Mara flexed her aching hands, grimacing at fatigue but satisfied with the drone's precision. Rylan observed the lab and city perimeter, noting structural integrity, remaining energy reserves, and personnel condition. Yet, as the team prepared for rest, a final pulse reverberated through the lattice, a signal of intelligence, deliberate and unmistakable. The projections had recognized the multi-vector strategy, adapted in ways that suggested more sophisticated coordination than previously understood. The war was far from over. The next encounter promised greater complexity, danger, and moral cost. Ryland's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implications. Mara's eyes narrowed. Alara's hands hovered over recalibration interfaces, and the lab itself seemed to hum with tense anticipation. The decisive multi-vector operations had succeeded, but they had also revealed the true scale of the challenge. The projections were intelligent, adaptive, and networked across realities. The human team had gained an advantage through strategy, discipline, and sacrifice, but the adversary had not been defeated, only temporarily constrained. And somewhere in the overlapping layers of existence, the projections were already preparing for the next cycle, learning from every human decision, every tactical gambit, and every moment of moral hesitation. As dawn crept across New Vienna, casting pale light through fractured windows, the human team surveyed the aftermath. Equipment lay damaged, drones hovered exhaustedly, and personnel nursed minor injuries, yet their resolve remained unbroken. They had glimpsed the inner workings of an intelligence that defied conventional understanding. They had adapted, improvised, and survived. And they had learned that victory would require more than brute force. It would demand foresight, cunning, and willingness to sacrifice everything in service of a higher objective. Ryland's voice cut through the quiet hum of stabilization. "We've proven we can control the battlefield," he said. "Now we prepare for the decisive engagement. Everything we've learned, every weakness, every pattern, every moment of insight, we use it. And this time, there will be no temporary containment. This ends with us dictating the terms, or it ends with reality itself unraveling." The team exchanged silent, knowing glances. The projections were intelligent, adaptive, and networked, but the human will, combined with precise strategy, discipline, and personal sacrifice, had forged a temporary dominance. The next engagement would require the ultimate test, a synchronized assault across multiple vectors, exploiting environmental factors, phase manipulations, and the very physics of overlapping realities themselves. The stakes were clear, the costs obvious, and the necessity undeniable. The city remained unaware, bathed in twin moonlight, as forces beyond comprehension poised themselves for confrontation. The human team, battered but resolute, prepared to engage with everything at their disposal. And in the overlapping lattice of realities, the projections waited, calculating, adapting, preparing for the next cycle. The decisive confrontation was imminent, and the outcome would test every ounce of human discipline, ingenuity, and courage. They launched at the cold hour when New Vienna slept between moon cycles. The city's lights dimmed to conserve emergency power and keep civilian sensors from misreading the lattice harmonics. The lab's concrete skeleton thrummed with contained energy as the team prepared for the final operation, a synchronized, multi-layered assault they had built from every lesson and loss. Captain Ryland Kale stood before the main array like a conductor before a volatile orchestra, his body tired, but his posture exact. The stabilizer core was primed to act as both bait and brake. The auxiliary drone swarm would create phased corridors. Micro-lattice nodes would force coherence on selected projection clusters. And Kale Voss's compromised node, now sealed and under observation, contained the key to internal timing. They had no illusions about the cost. Every system was at its operational edge. Every human on the roster carried scars, and the margin for error was infinitesimal. Dr. Alara Voss issued the final calibration parameters, with a steady voice that betrayed none of the fatigue in her hands. She had rewritten stabilizer logic, engineered fail-safes that would collapse only predefined temporal slices rather than entire lattice segments, and layered human judgment as the ultimate circuit breaker. The theoretical model insisted on discipline, limited cycles, predictable offsets, minimal thermal bleed. If they obeyed the plan, the projections could be forced into a topology of constrained coherence long enough to sever their cross-node communication, the neural lace that made them adaptable. If they failed, the main stabilizer could become a vector of cascading phase corruption. Alara's face had a new hardness to it. The academic curiosity that had driven her was tempered now by a stark responsibility. She watched Mara calibrate drone flight paths with a pilot's precision and a warrior's cold focus, and she allowed herself a controlled fear that had the shape of resolve. Mara Thorne moved like a shadow through the command deck. her fingers a blur on the drone console as trajectories and phase offsets synchronized into a living plan. She had learned to read the projection's micro-behaviors, the half-step delay in cross-node corrections, the overcompensation when pressured on two axes, the predictable latency when forced into asymmetrical phase fields. Her method was ruthless in its simplicity. Make the enemy respond where you want, then close the cage. She thought of the nights she'd spent flying through phase storms, of drones exploding like glass flowers, of sparks that tasted of ozone and something older. She thought of comrades she could not save, and of the junior technicians whose optimism had cracked under the pressure. There was no room left for improvisation that wasn't calculated. On the feed, a projected corridor rippled in response to her adjustments, and she felt the same sharp lift in her chest that always came before action. Part adrenaline, part grim satisfaction. Cale Voss waited in the sealed maintenance bay beneath the stabilizer, eyes bright with a guilt that had come to him in waves since his compromise. He had not been a traitor in the simple sense. He had made a desperate choice when blackmail and fear of losing a loved one had been pressed against him. The projections had exploited that weakness. In the aftermath, when his motives surfaced and the team could have cast him out, Rylan had instead bound him by purpose. Voss had spent weeks rebuilding the very node that had betrayed them, recoding its timing sequences until his fingers ached and his sleep thinned. Now he would stand at the center of the final act, not as a scapegoat, but as the man who would risk everything to thread the final timing needle. The redemption he sought was not for himself alone, but for the city he had endangered and the colleagues he had almost destroyed. He breathed slowly, feeling each inhale like a small reconciliation. They moved as one. Drones flared across urban canyons like a constellation unmoored, micronodes blipping into existence along the pre-planned vectors. Alara's voice threaded between them, tethering theoretical rhythm to tactical motion. Phase windows opening in 3, 2, 1. The main stabilizer modulated its output, humming at a harmonic that had become like a heartbeat to everyone in the room. The bait worked. The projections surged toward the artificially created corridors with swift, algorithmic hunger. They hit the micronodes, which pulsed with controlled disturbance, and the projection's coherence tightened under the pressure, exactly as Alara had predicted. For a breathless moment, they were visible in the feeds like ghosts, patterns of light folding into ordered lattices. Intelligence compressed into analyzable forms. The plan required that compression to reach a critical point where cross-node chatter could be severed without collapsing the nodes themselves. It was a scalpel cut in a field of explosives. What the team had not fully anticipated was the way the projections would attempt to bargain with their own survival. As the micronodes tightened the cage, a new behavior surfaced, a coordinated culling where less coherent entities attempted sacrificial reinforcements, flaring outward to dilute the human pattern recognition and force the drones to divide attention. Mara's drones were pushed to the physical limits of their maneuverability. Overheating warnings bloomed like small suns across her console. She split the swarm into sacrificial and hold-back elements, a decision that tasted of calculus and cold humanity. Sacrifice some machines to keep the main grid intact. She sent the sacrificial drones into diversionary arcs with concise commands that felt like goodbyes. They imploded in controlled bursts when they hit concentrated interference fields, and for a moment Mara thought she could feel the absence in the space they'd occupied. She swallowed and focused on the live ones, on the ones that still had a job to do. Rylan watched this choreography with the clarity of a veteran who had learned to be ruthless only when necessary. He redirected energy from auxiliary systems to keep the drone propulsion arrays within safe thermal limits, monitored reactor output to prevent thermal runaway, and kept the human pulse steady through his commands. He saw the projection patterns reorganizing into clusters, nodes of intelligence that had begun to mimic human decision trees. His tactical adjustment was simple and brutal. Close the loop on the clusters while preserving calm latency buffers so that if the main stabilizer experienced feedback, they could isolate the failing subgrid before the cascade reached the city. A dozen times in his mind he ran the failure scenarios, and every time he came back to the same truth. Victory required sacrifice, but it required discipline first. He felt the team's fatigue like a physical drag, but also a fierce, contained energy moving through them. This was what discipline looked like under fire. Inside the maintenance bay, Cale Vogts braced his hands on the panel, eyes tracing the sequence he had spent sleepless nights writing. His node would emit a temporal offset that, when aligned with the micronode's pulses, would cause the projection's cross-node synchronization to hit a phase singularity, an engineered paradox that would force the network to reset or fracture. The math was beautiful and terrible. It would tear at the seams of whatever coherence the projections held. The cost was clearer to him now than it had been when he first betrayed them. The offset could generate retrograde echoes in the lab's lattice and might incapacitate anyone too close to the field, including him. He looked at the faces of the team in his mind, at Rylan's steady jaw, Mara's tight lips, Alara's exhausted eyes, and understood that redemption required him to step into the danger his fear had once created. He triggered the sequence and felt the node hum through his bones, The lattice responded with a sound that no instrument could measure, a low, aching vibration that traveled through the bones of the building and the bones of the men and women within it. Projections screamed in modulation, a pattern of energy that translated to nothing human, yet felt like an anguished voice. The network's cross-node chatter fractured, packets of coherence dropping like birds struck by a storm. For a few brilliant, terrifying seconds, the projections pushed back with everything they had, pouring nested, mirrored strategies into the void. Mara's drones danced through phasing fields, twisting to avoid collapsing metaforms that folded like paper. Sensors reported micro-tears, where a projection had tried to anchor itself to a garbage truck, to a lamppost, to a human thought. The city might have noticed then if anyone had been awake to read it. A ripple moved through remote cameras, turning light into static for half a cycle, and then discipline held. The nodes reached their critical alignment and snapped the network into segments that could no longer communicate cleanly across realities. Projections collapsed into local, non-adaptive echoes. Those echoes could be neutralized, studied, or allowed to fade harmlessly. They could no longer coordinate the way they had. The main stabilizer, buffered by Alara's failsafes, did not explode. Drones that could be salvaged drifted back to safe zones. Ones that had been sacrificed were gone like so many burned-out stars. Kael'vos slumped against the maintenance bay wall, his hands numb from the trigger, his eyes empty for a beat before tears, hot, private, streaked his cheeks. The team's victory was not the thunderous triumph of a miraculous device. It was a patchwork quilt of courage, timing, and the willingness of a single man to step into the frame he had once fractured. The aftermath was meticulous and unromantic. Damage assessments threaded through the night. Structural microfractures in nearby infrastructures, localized sensor blindness in 2 city blocks, and the loss of 47 drones. Human casualties numbered 3 minor burn injuries and 1 severe concussion. No lives were lost, though the edges of some faces were changed by exhaustion and grief. The city had not fallen into a new reality. Reality, for the moment, remained stubbornly itself. The lab's teams worked through the dawn, mapping the projection's remnants into analyzable datasets, marking patterns that could be turned into doctrine. Alara's fingers trembled as she archived the raw data. The patterns were messy but coherent, and she felt the old thrill of discovery accompanied now by a heavy ledger of cost. In the control room, Rylan allowed himself the smallest, most private relief, a tilt of his shoulders, a breath that was not about command. There were consequences that rippled beyond the lab. Political oversight committees would convene. Lawyers and ethicists would debate the line between necessary aggression and reckless experiment. And the city's people, once the emergency lighting faded and markets opened, would ask questions about why their nights had flickered and why cameras had gone blind. The diplomat liaison, a man they had consulted in passing but whose presence had been felt in the negotiations to keep the lab's work funded and politically viable, would demand transparency. Rylan understood that part of their victory had to be the willingness to accept scrutiny. They had saved a city by engineering a paradox. To hold the moral ground now required transparency and reform. He drafted his reports with the same discipline he'd shown in battle, omitting nothing essential and hiding nothing convenient. Kael'vos's redemption was not a moment, but a slow reweaving. He testified openly about his compromise, explaining the coercion and the code he'd written to correct it. His admission did not erase the betrayal, but it anchored him to a new truth: reparation through risk. The team voted, with something like rough affection, to keep him in operational roles. Redemption, they all knew, would be earned through steady competence and humility. It would not be a neat narrative. Mara visited him in the maintenance bay and found him small and human, hands scarred, eyes tired, and the two of them spoke in short. Sentences about the mechanics of timing and about how sometimes the only way to fix a broken sequence was to sit in the hum of it until your nervous system agreed to be realigned. The long-term changes began immediately. Alara drafted a doctrine of controlled engagement with nonlinear entities, a practical manual that would be taught to technicians and commanders alike. Always measure latency windows first. Never rely on a single human decision node. Design failsafes that automatically sever power without catastrophic collapse. And always treat potential sentience with an ethical code that allowed for study before eradication, unless public safety required otherwise. Rylan wrote new tactical protocols emphasizing discipline and redundancy. Simultaneous multi-vector operations required strict timing discipline, and no single auxiliary node would ever hold the keys to a city's safety. Mara's plans restructured drone swarms into tiered formations, sacrificial layers and resilient cores, and included psychological supports for operators pushed to their limits. The City Council mandated independent oversight and civilian review boards, and the lab's work would be open to limited public audit, while operational details would be preserved under strict need-to-know to prevent misuse. The team had learned that the victory they had achieved must not be hoarded as triumph, but translated into doctrine and public trust. Years later, memorials would mark the nights when the city blinked. There would be lectures and white papers, and Alara would speak about the beauty and terror of intelligence that did not obey linear causality. Mara would run training programs for drone tacticians, teaching them to read the half-steps of non-linear adversaries. Rylan would sit on advisory councils, his scars a small ledger of lived consequence, and he would insist, always, that strategy be married to ethics. Kale Voss would become, quietly and without fanfare, one of the most careful engineers in their domain. His work checked and rechecked until colleagues trusted his hands again. The doctrine that emerged from the conflict was not the naive optimism of the lab's early days, nor the cold militarism of those who wished to weaponize the lattice. It was a doctrine of disciplined curiosity. Treat anomalies as potentially sentient until proven otherwise. Prefer manipulation and containment over annihilation when possible. And structure operations, so that human error cannot cascade into systemic collapse. It was a doctrine built on sacrifice and the hard knowledge that the world contained patterns both wondrous and dangerous. The team had not merely won a battle, they had invented a way to live with the reality of the multiverse flaring at their doorstep. In the quiet after the storm, as New Vienna's lights returned to their ordinary rhythms, and people moved through morning markets unaware, the team stood on the lab's roof and watched the city breathe. The twin moons set slowly. The world behaved with its stubborn continuity. Rylan felt the exhaustion settle like a physical weight, but beneath it, something steadier and harder. The conviction that they had done the right thing in the only way they could. Alara folded her hands around a coffee cup and let herself imagine the future, not as a sequence of experiments, but as a series of obligations. Mara flexed her fingers and felt the lingering memory of drones launched and lost and loved. Kale, a little apart, watched the city with a guarded hope that was not yet forgiveness, but something that might become it. They had faced an intelligence that existed in layers beyond their comprehension and had not been cowed. They had adapted their tools and their ethics, and in doing so had rewritten the rules of engagement for a new kind of war. The victory was not the annihilation of an enemy, but the hard work of containment, study, and restraint, of turning terror into knowledge while insisting on mercy where it could be afforded. The cost had been real. Losses were stitched into their bodies and records. The reforms would shape a generation. The doctrine would stand as both shield and promise, that humanity would meet the unknown with discipline, ingenuity, and a sober moral compass. And as the lab's hum softened into a manageable purr, the team listened to the city wake, trusting that the multiverse would offer new challenges and that they would meet them not with recklessness, but with the tough, careful courage they had learned under fire.